I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume, so I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. I am continuing reading in the Gospels. We're right at the end. We had, the triumphal entry, Last Supper, arrest, trials, and we read the crucifixion, both in Matthew and in Mark. Now, the Joseph Smith translation of Matthew gave us a lot of new details. And what we're going to do now is we're going to read the Joseph Smith translation of Mark to see what new details we can get here. So this is the Joseph Smith translation of Mark chapter 15, verses 16 to 47. In 16, we just changed call together to called together. In 17, instead of put it about his head, it is upon his head. In 18, began to salute him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. In 21, this is somewhat interesting. Instead of they compel one, it is they compelled. Fits the grammar, fits the tense. But now instead of the father of Alexander and Rufus, it is Alexandria and Rufus. So instead of two brothers, it's a sister and a brother. Now that's fun. I like that. That's an interesting change. I still have no idea who these people were, but it's an interesting change. And again, we have in verse 22, place of a skull is corrected to place of a burial. We had that same correction in Matthew. In 23, it now reads, And they gave him to drink vinegar mingled with gall. And when he had tasted the vinegar, he would not drink. So again, the vinegar mixed with gall is a type of painkiller. It dulls the senses so you don't feel the pain as much. In verse 25, instead of and they crucified him, it is when they crucified him. It was the third hour when they crucified him. But verse 26 now reads this. And Pilate wrote his accusation and put it upon the cross, the King of the Jews. There were certain of the high priests who stood by and said unto Pilate, Write that he said, I am King of the Jews. But Pilate said unto them, What I have written, I have written. We had this same correction in Matthew. And it's really, as I said then, it is Pilate is writing this to let the world know that Jesus was being crucified because the Jewish leaders were envious of him. He was innocent. His accusation isn't that he was lying and calling himself the king. His accusation is that he was telling the truth. And because he was an honest and just man, they had him killed. In verse 27, instead of they crucify two thieves, it is they crucified two thieves. In verse 28, saith is corrected to said. In verse 29, they that passed is now they who passed, and thou that destroyest is now thou who destroyest. And verse 32 now reads, Let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe him. And one of them who was crucified with him reviled him also, saying, If thou art the Christ, save thyself and us. Now we had a similar correction in Matthew, but this time it is just saying one of them was mocking him. It doesn't mention the other one asking for grace, asking for forgiveness. That's not mentioned here in Mark. But we do have that it is only one who was reviling it. In verse 34, the only change is that the phrase being interpreted is now put into parentheses. In verse 35, instead of them that stood by, it's them who stood by, and instead of they heard it, it is they heard him. In 36, this is interesting. It now reads, And put on a reed and gave him to drink. Others spake, saying, Let him alone. So that definitely makes it more clear, because without the others spake, it's a little confusing. But again, just a clarification. In verse 39, instead of which stood over, it is who stood over. And at the end, truly this is the Son of God. Isn't that interesting? In verse 40, instead of James the less, it is James the younger. In verse 41, we remove the parentheses, and at the end it is many other women who came with him unto Jerusalem. In verse 42, we have the addition of the word day. It was the preparation day. In verse 43, which is corrected to who. In verse 44, it now reads, And Pilate marveled and asked him if he were already dead. And calling the centurion, he asked him if he had been any while dead. And in 46, he is corrected, and Joseph bought fine linen. That's just a nice clarification. And that is it. We have the same two main clarifications, that only one of the thieves were mocking, and the recounting of Pilate writing, of the Jews complaining about Pilate writing, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews," on his accusation tablet. Other than that, there's really not much else to talk about too much. I did like that as Alexander is corrected to Alexandria. I'm going to have to do a little research on that and see what's going on. But as that stands, we leave it there, and we will be reading the story of the crucifixion in Luke next. So I will see you there.